Welcome to episode 29 of the Within the Boggart Wood podcast, and welcome back after a slightly longer summer break than planned, primarily due to workload and the fact that I've not been able to speak for protracted periods of time due to a molar cracking neatly in half and then getting nicely infected. But as I've said before, this isn't a horror podcast, so I shall move swiftly on. At the time of this episode first airing, it's the beginning of September 2024. Halloween stuff has started to appear in the shops, alongside Christmas chocolates and even sweet mince pies and Christmas cake in some supermarkets. So seeing all that suddenly brought things home how close we are to spooky season. Last year, the podcast Halloween episode was recorded over Zoom with guests from the Do Business Network. This year, I've decided that the 2024 Halloween episode will be again recorded via Zoom with guests from the Court of Boggart's paid Patreon tier attending. I'll do the same as last time. I'll go through the main story, which currently has the simple working title of The Haunting of Historic Dilson. Then we'll be able to have a chat and a ghost story session. The Court of Boggart's Patreon tier should be able to see a poll on Patreon asking for day and time preferences, which I'll firm up nearer the time. The Zoom session will be edited into the Halloween episode for general consumption, and depending on the attendee's preference, may also appear on YouTube in its video form. For folk that are unaware, Patreon is a community platform that allows listeners to donate to creators. There is a free tier that allows you to join in discussions. Then for Boggart Wood we have the Court of Boggarts, which for £3 a month helps me enormously with costs of running, researching and producing the podcast. As a very small independent podcast, I don't get any income from it in the form of advertising or such like, or help with marketing, so everything is out of my own pocket, and the Court of Boggarts help just to keep things manageable. So many thanks again for all of your support. If anyone wants to join the discussions, or even wants to sign up for the Court of Boggarts, I'll put the Patreon link in the episode description, or just search for Within the Boggart Wood on the Patreon platform. Today's first story takes us into the Scottish Borders and tales of redcaps. Redcaps are one of those northern goblins that you really don't want to meet alone on a dark stormy night. These creatures from local folklore simply have no redeeming social features, and make the malevolent Dvergar at Simonside in Northumberland look like Disney's Seven Dwarfs. 19th century folklorists such as William Henderson described them physically as short, thick-set old men with long hair, red eyes, talons like those of eagles on the ends of their spindly long fingers, and conspicuous teeth. Your average redcap dressed rustically, with iron boots and a red cap, hence their name, on their heads. Their favourite weapon was a pike, a heavy spear favoured by infantry between the 14th and the 18th century. So where were the redcaps said to haunt? In some tales, redcaps are conjured by sorcerers to act as guards, servants or familiars, but more commonly these goblins are said to take up residence in ruined towers and castles throughout the Scottish Borders and Northumberland, wherever there had been tyranny or bloody conflict. In fact, in Sir Walter Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, he claims, "Redcap is a popular appellation of that class of spirits which haunt old castles. Every ruined tower in the south of Scotland is supposed to have an inhabitant of this species." From my research, I think this volume of his works was published in 1810. It was said that when a redcap took up residence in a ruined tower house or castle, he made his den and patrolled the dark empty corridors on the lookout for intruders. If a traveller happened on the castle and sought shelter there, the redcap would usually pelt the person with large rocks to soften them up a little, before closing in with a pike, claw and tooth, catching their flowing blood in his cap. The brighter the goblin's cap, the more recent their last kill. Redcaps were said to be fast creatures, and that running wouldn't help you. They were also said to be strong and impervious to human weaponry, meaning that once a redcap had you in its sights, then a gruesome death was certain. That is, unless you had a crucifix handy, or knowledge of the Holy Scripture. It was said that if a redcap was presented with a crucifix, much like you see in the movies with modern vampires, then the creature would scream and recoil. If you knew the right scripture, and had the nerve to recite it while dodging rocks, sharp implements and claws, then Redcap would burst into a pillar of flame and vanish, leaving behind one of his teeth, presumably in the hope of getting a groat from the Tooth Fairy. Because of this apparently volatile reaction, some folklorists have suggested that redcaps should be classed more as demons than goblins. Redcaps brought into the world by a magical summoning were also in some tales said to possess the ability to grant the sorcerer supernatural abilities. The most famous tale regarding this is that of Hermitage Castle in the Scottish Borders and its 13th century Lord Soulis. Hermitage Castle is located in Liddesdale in the Scottish Middlemarch, now the Scottish Borders, and according to historian George MacDonald Fraser was built as the guardhouse of the bloodiest valley in Britain. Interestingly, certainly the de Soulis family held Hermitage Castle in the early 13th century, but not the Hermitage Castle on site now, a salient fact often ignored by folklorists and paranormal researchers. Work began on the castle that stands today in around AD 1360, with archaeologists and historians suggesting that the de Soulis castle was likely further to the west by the chapel ruins, or the 14th century castle was built over the de Soulis residence. The original castle was a timber motte and bailey structure, built in AD 1240 by Nicholas de Soulis, with the tale of the dark deeds resting with one of his successors, William de Soulis. De Soulis died in 1320 and his lands were forfeited to the crown, and in 1338 the castle was captured by the Scottish Sir William Douglas, but by 1360 English Lord Hugh de Dacre, who gained the castle through marriage, began construction of the stone-filled fortified manor house on the site, which some think was never completed. Hermitage had changed hands yet again by 1371, when it was in the possession of the first Earl of Douglas. Douglas then rebuilt Dacre's Hall as a massive stone keep, with his son adding the corner towers at the end of the 14th century. The castle began to fall into ruin and disuse during the early 17th century, with the dark raw gloominess attracting figures such as Sir Walter Scott in the early 19th century. Due to the ruin's rising popularity in literature, the owner, the 5th Duke of Buccleuch, undertook a massive amount of restoration to the structure, but it was eventually placed into the care of the state in 1930. It was, however, the 18th century writer Dr. John Leyden who brings us to the supernatural element of Hermitage, with the ballad writer taking us back to William de Soulis. In life, history tells us that de Soulis was heavily disliked by his servants, and generally just wasn't a very pleasant chap all round. In 1320, however, he took part in an uprising against Robert the Bruce which failed. De Soulis was captured and imprisoned in Dumbarton Castle, where he died. Leyden's tale, however, is a tad different. In it, Soulis was said to be a devilish tyrant, a large powerful man whose physical strength matched his appetite for blood. Legend had it that he was also a sorcerer, versed in the dark arts, and so in order to gain a magical advantage during battle, Soulis conjured up a local demon to be his familiar, a redcap named Sly or Robin depending on the version. Sly would take part in his cruelest rituals, usually involving the blood of local children, where Sly would use the rituals to keep his cap a nice fresh red colour. As blood payment, Sly laid an enchantment on de Soulis, where the man could not be harmed by blade or by arrow, and de Soulis did all he could to put that to the test, coming out of battle unharmed every time. One day, however, de Soulis decided that the castle was a little lonesome, and his roving eye fell on a young woman from the Armstrong family. Knowing he could not be killed by Armstrong weapons, he kidnapped the woman, whose name some say was Marion, and headed back to Hermitage, not before dispatching the elder Armstrong along the way. De Soulis, uncaring that the old man had been popular in the area, soon found himself at the mercy of a lynch mob who had taken a little side trip to see another local sorcerer, who had given them magical ropes to bind him. With the aid of the ropes, de Soulis was overpowered by the mob, bound and taken to the summit of nearby Ninestane Rig, where they had a warming surprise set up for him. Knowing that he could not be killed by normal means, they had a huge bubbling cauldron of lead set over a fire, and in it they dropped him, and that was the sticky end of William de Soulis. Redcap Sly, though, escaped the wrath of the villagers, and it is said that he haunts the ruins of Hermitage Castle to this day, lying in wait for lonely travellers so that he can refresh the red of his cap. And now for something a little different, a book review. In July, archaeologist and author Steve Toase had his book Dirt Upon My Skin published by Blackshuck Books. The book is a collection of short horror stories, inspired by the author's time as a field archaeologist. Now it has been a good while since I've just sat down to read a book for entertainment rather than research, so Steve's book was a welcome treat. Dirt Upon My Skin holds 10 short stories, so you can dip in and out of the book as you wish to. None of the stories are linked, with each delving into a facet of archaeology and dark folklore, from archaeological excavations in the land of the Fae to, shall I say, without spoilers, a zombie apocalypse in a somewhat different and flighty form. The author's style is direct and descriptive, and he doesn't pull any punches. To me, as a field archaeologist myself, there were sections out of the 10 stories where my own memories were clearly triggered by the author's style, especially certain scenes during characters building recording sections. So, for me, Steve's book scores 10 out of 10. Whether you like archaeology, folklore or ghost stories, please check out Dirt Upon My Skin, written by Steve Toase and published by Blackshuck Books. I'll put the relevant links in the episode description. Today's second story looks at the simple fact that just because a story is written centuries ago doesn't mean it's authentic. There is a habit by some researchers at presuming that the older the source, the more valid it is, but in the case of the small County Durham village of Edmundbyers in the 17th century, old does not mean trustworthy. Locally, Edmundbyers often comes up in tales of witchcraft, in no small part thanks to the tale of Margaret Hooper. Margaret's story occurred in 1641, published in a volume named Strange News in that year. Her story revolves around the alleged demonic possession of Mrs. Hooper and her subsequent rescue by an angel-like figure. The account in the pamphlet reads, "Upon the 15th day of November, now last past, 1641, there is a yeoman of good and honest reputation, dwelling in the town of Edmundbyers, upon Derwentwater in the bishopric of Durham, whose name is Stephen Hooper, a man of good wealth, and also beloved of his neighbours, who being sick and lying in weak state, sent his wife, whose name was Margaret Hooper, to a farm which he had in a village some 3 miles off, at whose coming thither it seemed all things were not according to her mind. Thus continuing there one day, and something more, she returned home to her husband, partly aggrieved at such things as she thought her husband might reform, if God lent him life. Now, when she was come home to Edmundbyers, she found her husband recovered to an indifferent health, to whom she began to use very much idle talk, as well concerning the same farms, and also concerning an old groat, which her son, being a little boy, had found about a week before. Thus she continued as if she had been one bewitched, or haunted with an evil spirit, until the Wednesday at night following, which night she took her rest, something indifferently until the morning, at which time she began with much vain speech to disquiet her husband, and to use much idle talk, but her husband, seeing her in such a mind, and finding that she was, as it were, desperate, he persuaded her to call upon God, and that being the creature of God, she should not forget to call upon her Creator in the day of trouble. Wherefore he counselled her to pray with him, and to say the Lord's Prayer after him, which she partly did. But the devil, who always doth build the chapel so much as he may to vex God's church, began to withdraw her from prayer, and to put her in mind to call in most fearful sort for the groat, which her son had lately found, and also for her wedding ring, desiring to see them with all speed. Her husband made no great haste thereto, but continued in prayer that it would please God to send her a most quiet spirit, and to strengthen her that faith might speedily vanquish such vanity in her. But the more he prayed and persuaded her to prayer, the more she seemed to be as if she were troubled with some evil spirit, calling for the old groat, which her husband neglected to show her. Whereat she began with a very stern and staring countenance to look on her husband in the most wonderful sort, that he was sore affrighted. Then he called for her sister, for that he was not able to keep her in bed, which when her sister and others were come into the chamber, they kept her down violently in her bed. And forthwith she was so sore tormented that she foamed at the mouth, and was shaken with such force that the bed and the chamber did shake and move in the most strange sort. Her husband continued praying for her deliverance, so that within 1/2 hour after her shaking was past, she began to tell him she had been in the town to beat away the bear which followed her from the yard when she came from Hanstelworth. Then her husband and friends, wishing her to leave those vain imaginations, persuaded her that it was nothing but the lightness of her brains, which was very idle for want of rest. Wherefore her husband and friends exhorted her to say the Lord's Prayer with them, which she did, and after took some rest, and thus she continued until the Saturday morning, in which time she continued raging, as it were distract of her memory, which came by fits, to the great grief of her husband, friends and neighbours. Yet upon the Saturday there were some hopes of her recovery, for that she took some reasonable rest, to the comfort of her husband and friends, and upon the Sunday she seemed to be very patient and comfortable until midnight, at which time the candle was set burning in the same chamber was burned. She then suddenly awaking called to her husband, and crying out, saying that she did see a strange thing like unto a snail, carrying a fire in a most wonderful sort. Whereat her husband was amazed, and seeing the candle was clean burnt out, called to his brothers and sisters that were in the house, with others of her friends, watching and sitting up to comfort her, if her extreme fit should in any way molest her, who hearing him call, come in, and brought a candle lighted, and set it upon the table, which stood near where the woman lay. She began to wax very fearful, saying to her husband and the rest, Did you not see the devil? Whereat they desired her to remember God, and to call for grace, that her faith might wanly be fixed upon him, to the vanquishing the devil and his assaults. Hell, if you see nothing now, you shall see something by and by. And forthwith they heard a great noise in the streets, as if it had been the coming of 4 or 5 carts, and presently they in the chamber cried out, saying, Lord, help us, what manner of thing is this that cometh here? Then her husband, looking up in his bed, espied a thing coming to the bed, much like a bear, but it had no head nor tail, 1/2 yard in height, and 1/2 yard in length. Her husband, seeing it come to the bed, rose up, and took a joint stool, and struck at the same thing. The stroke sounded as though it had struck it upon a feather bed. Then it came to the woman, and stroke her 3 times upon the feet, took her out of the bed, and so ruled her to and fro in the chamber and under the bed. The people then present, to the number of 7 persons, were also greatly amazed with this horrible sight, that they knew not what to do, yet they called still upon God for his assistance. But the candle was so dimmed that they could scarcely see one another. At last this monster, which we suppose to be the devil, so ruled her around the round compass, like a hoop, through the other chambers, down the high pair of stairs into the hall, where he kept her the space of 1/4 of an hour. Her husband, and they in the chamber above, durst not come down to her, but remained in prayer, weeping at the stairs' head, grievously lamenting to see her so carried away. There was such a horrible stink in the hall, and such fiery flames, that they were glad to stop their noses with clothes and napkins. Then the woman cried out, calling to her husband, Now he is gone. Then quoth he, In the name of God, come up to me. And so even upon the sudden she was come up so quickly, that they greatly marvelled at it. Then they brought her to bed, and 4 of them kept down the clothes about the bed, and continued to pray about her. The candle could not burn clear, but it was very dim, and suddenly the woman was out of the bed, and the window of the bed head open. Whether the woman unpinned the window, or how it came to pass, they knew not, but it was opened, and the woman's legs after a miraculous manner thrust out of the window. The people of the chamber heard a thing knock at her feet, as if it had been upon a tub, and they saw a great fire, and it seemed to them, at her feet, the stink thereof was horrible. After describing the solemn manner in which by prayer they invoked the aid of the Almighty, the account concludes by saying, At last they espied a thing like unto a little child, with a very bright shining countenance, casting a great light in the chamber, and the candle burned very brightly, so that they might see one another. Then they fell flat to the ground, and prayed the Lord that they had so wonderfully assisted them, and so the child vanished away. Then the woman, being better, feeling of herself, was laid in her bed, and asked forgiveness at God's hands, and of all she had offended, acknowledging that it was for her sins that she was so sore tormented of the evil spirit, and God be thanked she hath been ever since in some reasonable order. For there hath been with her many godly learned men from divers places of the country. These are the names of the witnesses that it is most true: Stephen Hooper, John Hooper, John Eiley, Alexander Eagleston, Anthony Westgarth, and Alice Eagleston. So this tale is often cited as a good local County Durham early example of demonic possession, but the tale isn't what it appears to be. Now, rewind to 57 years before the case of Margaret Hooper, and we travel down to Ditchett in Somerset. In 1584, the following tale appeared in a pamphlet, a true most dreadful discourse of a woman possessed with the devil, who, in the form of a headless bear, fetched her out of her bed, and in the presence of several persons, rolled her thoroughly through 3 chambers, and down a high pair of stairs on the 24th of May last, 1584, at Ditchett in the county of Somersetshire, a matter as miraculous as ever was seen in our time. The tale revolves around one Margaret Hooper, whose husband Stephen, upon being ill, sent her to a nearby town of Rockhampton in Gloucestershire for supplies. Upon her return, though, she was feverish and incoherent, telling him of their son finding an old groat. Her mental state declined, and Stephen instructed her to call on God and recite Lord's Prayer, but she could only part recite it. Calling to her sister and some friends for help, by the time they arrived, she was foaming at the mouth and rambling about a bear that had followed her home. At this point, I'll stop telling this story, as it's literally a carbon copy of the Edmundbyers story, or should I say, Edmundbyers was a carbon copy of the Ditchit one, with a couple of changes. The 1584 Margaret Hooper became Margaret Hooper in 1641. Her husband Stephen became Stephen Hooper. Their son John became John Hooper. Even in the witness list, their friend Alice Eston became Alice Eagleston. In his 2013 thesis, Rethinking Demonic Possession, Dr. Harman Bogle notes that the Edmundbyers story was obviously a fabrication. The original Cooper story had also been reprinted at least once in 1613, so the story was obviously a popular one. Bogle theorised that the stories of demonic possession indicated society's sense of impending Armageddon, with the 1641 Edmundbyers version coming soon after the 1640 Scottish invasion of northern England. The question is, though, was the 1584 story in Ditchit the original? The answer to that question is unknown at this time, but if anyone knows of any earlier stories of the same ilk, please let me know. Keeping with the devilish theme, today's From the Archive section comes from the Todmorden Advertiser and Hebdenbridge newsletter, 1879, and is titled Possessed of a Devil. The article actually details a case in Amherst, Nova Scotia, Canada. The girl Esther Cox, a resident of Amherst, Nova Scotia, who some months ago created a good deal of comment among citizens and the clergy, has been quiet for some weeks, and little has been heard of her. The case, as reported at the time, looks very much like as though Miss Esther was possessed of a devil. Some of the freaks of the evil spirits were curious, and one of them was a handwriting on the wall, warning her that if she did not leave the house of her relative, Mr. Teed, shoemaker, the house would be torn down about her ears. She asked who made the threats, and the writing on the wall answered, the evil spirits. That night she slept in the house, and the noise of pounding upon the roof was terrible. In the morning the house was set on fire in 5 different places, and Esther was forced to leave. She went away from the village, and the spirits ceased to trouble her. A month afterwards she came back. This was about the end of November, and she had been but a few days in the village when the manifestations commenced again, and the poor girl was distracted. A press reporter visited her at Amherst, and received corroboration of the above stories from the Reverend Mr. Temple, the Methodist minister of that place, and from Dr. Carroll, and from the first citizens of the town. Since that time, manifestations have been heard of from time to time. So, thanks for listening to episode 29 of the podcast. For more information on Within the Boggart Wood, please see the podcast website at theboggartwood.uk. Until next time, stay safe and stay spooky.